Hey guys, I'm Ani. Welcome to my YouTube channel. Today we're going to be learning how to solder. First thing that you'll need to solder, of course, is your soldering iron itself, which will melt the tin and allow you to connect electrical components together. Along with the soldering iron is an on and off switch, which allows for easy operation. Also on the soldering iron itself, there is a temperature modulation switch, which you can use to change the temperature. Usually we'll keep it between 350 and 400 degrees Celsius. Next up we have a soldering iron stand. This can help to keep your soldering iron safe while you're not using it and allows you to keep it on a stand when it's hot so that you don't have to touch it. Here is a small little stand that also has an area for a sponge. Next up, we need something to be able to clean our soldering iron. Here I have some brass shavings, which I can use to wipe off my soldering iron after I'm finished using it. This brass shaving will easily shave off all of the excess tin from your soldering iron and allow you to have a clean solder for the next time you use it. Next up, we have some solder. This is lead-free solder, which is basically a mixture of tin and a little bit of silver. We use this to melt onto our electrical components to stick them together. Solder is conductive, which means it conducts electricity so that it can be used to connect them together. Next up, I have a wire stripper cum wire cutter. It can cut wires and also strip them so that we can use the copper inside to fold on to our electrical components. Next up, we need some wire to connect our components together. Here I have some copper bell wire. It isn't the best wire you can use to solder, but it's okay. Now I have some optional components that you don't need but are pretty helpful. Here is a helping hands. It's basically a magnifying glass with some clips. You can use them to hold together your components when you're soldering so you don't have to hold them yourself. Here's another optional component. It is a desoldering sucker. It's also called a solder sucker. You can use it to suck up solder that you don't need, and you can use it to disconnect your solder connections. Now it's time to start soldering. First, you need to put your soldering iron into your stand and set your temperature to between 350 and 450 degrees Celsius. Then connect up your soldering iron to the power plug and switch it on. When it's switched on, it should glow red like this. Now you want to grab your lead-free solder and put it aside when we'll need it, as well as your helping hands and the item that you're soldering. Here we're using a motor and we're soldering on some bell wire, so you also need to keep your wire by your side. But first thing, before we start soldering, we need to let our solder heat up. So in the meantime, let's cut up our wire and prepare to solder. So first things first, let's cut our wire with our wire stripper and wire cutter. And afterwards, we want to strip one side of the wire so that we can solder it onto our motor. Now, using your wire stripper, you want to put your wire into the hole that is right for it, and then twist your wire stripper onto the wire. Afterwards, you want to cut off the rubber from the top, and you have your exposed copper wire. After stripping both of your wires, we can move on to bending it onto our motor. First, you'll need to take out your motor and identify both of the strips that we'll need to solder our wires onto. After that, you want to put in your wire into the slot of the motor and then bend the wire around the motor slot just like this. Once your wire is twisted tightly onto your motor and your soldering iron is heated and ready to go, you can insert your motor into your helping hands and use your soldering iron to solder up your connection. Once your solder joint is ready to go, just heat up some tin and melt it onto your soldering iron, and then clean it off so that your solder tip is nice and clean, and then we can begin to solder our joint. Clean off your soldering iron, just put your tip into the brass shavings and rummage it around so that all the tin comes off. Now you want to adjust your wire so that it's comfortable, and then you want to begin to solder. So to begin, what you want to do is put your soldering iron onto the joint so that it starts to heat up. And then you want to begin to introduce the tin so that the tin starts flowing through the joint and connects the wires together. After you finish soldering the joint, clean up your tips so you can get ready for the next one. After the wire is cooled off, you can remove it from the helping hands and test the connection to see if it's strong. And if it is, we can move on to the next wire. Once you're ready for the second wire, just clip it onto your helping hands and follow the steps so that you can solder in your second joint. Always remember to be careful not to touch your soldering iron with your hand, and be careful not to get burned. Now just melt on some solder to your tip, heat up your joint, and let the solder do the work and flow into the joint. Now for some even more soldering practice, let's solder on a battery pack to our motor so we can spin it. Let's split our other wires and begin. After you've stripped the wires on your battery pack as well, always remember before soldering to take off the batteries from the battery pack so that they don't heat up. After you're ready, wrap around your copper wire onto your bell wire, put it into your helping hands, and start soldering the joint. Now it's time to solder our last solder joint and see if the motor spins. Here's an image of the completed soldering. You can see that the joints are nice and strong so that they won't come off. Now let's add in the batteries and test the motor.